He's running for president, and he's my guest today. Mike Huckabee, former Arkansas governor, popular author, and successful Fox television host, joins me next on Significant Insights. Hello and welcome to the show. Several months ago, before he announced his candidacy for president, I had the opportunity to talk with former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee. Now, at the time, he had already left his talk show on the Fox network because he was seriously interested in looking into another presidential run. Well, in May, he made it official. So recently, I had the chance to talk with him again. In my earlier interview this year, we talked about the changes in our country since his run for president 8 years ago. In this, my second interview with now candidate Huckabee, we talked about actions he would take and directives he would issue if he became president. We began our discussion with his comprehensive understanding of Middle East ideology and politics and his thoughts on the idea of a Palestinian state. You said in a recent speech that the idea of a Palestinian state was nutty. In fact, I think you used that word.
I did use that word. Because
Explain yourself.
The idea that you can have two governments, one of which refuses to acknowledge the existence of the other, overseeing the same piece of real estate is simply nutty. I'll use the word again. I don't know why we continue to believe that we can make something work that is on its face unworkable. Jerusalem, for example, can't be divided and properly governed. It's not possible. One of the things for which I admire Israel, it has protected the holy sites of not just Jews, but also of Christians and Muslims. It protects the Muslim sites with the same vigor with which it protects the holy Jewish sites. Do you think that the Muslims, under the Palestinian Authority, do you think that they would protect the Jewish and Christian sites with the same vigor? Well, clearly, there's no indication they would, based on what they've done in other places where they had other control and burned churches and destroyed antiquities. So just from an obvious standpoint, there's a reason. But I also believe that the notion that you can have two people trying to claim and govern the same piece of real estate from two totally different perspectives is maybe wishful political thinking, but it's not grounded in reality.
You've also been very outspoken in the Iranian deal.
Yeah.
And my first question with that, it appears this is a treaty, and yet it's being called a deal. Is there a significant difference as to why it's being called a deal rather than a treaty?
Well, the difference between a deal and the treaty is that a treaty requires a supermajority to pass the Senate, whereas a deal can get by with a simple majority. And I think it's very problematic because this is a treaty. It has all the markings, makings, and effects of a treaty. I believe Republicans made a big mistake in ever agreeing to let this be a matter of approving an executive action, an executive agreement. And
so as a deal, it could be an executive order, or it could
executive
be
agreement, and therefore it has a lower threshold. That was a very, very deadly, foolish mistake. I don't know why they thought that they could ever trust Barack Obama and John Kerry to sit down with the Iranians and make a deal that would be a good one. I certainly never felt that way. And I certainly didn't feel that the Iranians could be capable of such a deal that would be worth us agreeing to unless they made major changes and concessions. I would love for them to have made them. I would love for them to have said, you know, we've been wrong about threatening Israel. We've been wrong about threatening America. We've been wrong about denying the Holocaust. We've been wrong to have kept hostages and murdered Americans and supplying Hamas and Hezbollah. And we've been wrong in supplying terrorists their resources all over the world to kill people. So we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to acknowledge Israel's right to exist. We'll quit chanting death to America. Now you have the basis for diplomacy. That's not what we have, Jerry. We have people that even as we negotiated, were chanting death to America, and government officials continuing to say that they would wipe Israel off the face of the map.
What do you believe is the president's motivation when most of the country is against it? Most of our allies, Middle East allies, Saudi Arabia, Israel, all are against it. What's the motivation?
Yeah, everybody in the neighborhood around Iran is against this. Shouldn't that tell us something? It didn't apparently tell the Europeans or the president, but let's be real honest. When you read through the deal, the 159 pages of this, what you come to the conclusion is dozens of the pages are the listings of the various multinational corporations whose assets will be unfrozen. It hit me as I was reading through the deal. This is about money. This is all about money. The pressure from the Europeans, the pressure from many of the Americans, is pressure from the business interest of the Europeans and the Americans who had their assets frozen and now will have those assets unfrozen because of this deal. This is one of those typical cases, follow the dollar and you'll follow the motive. And I'm convinced that a lot of it is that. And I think some of it is this is a very naive president when it comes to the issues of the Middle East and particularly of radical Islam and of terrorism. And he is following his naive instincts to their deadly conclusion.
Let's go back to Israel for just a minute. Israel is putting Iron Dome weapons on all of its borders now, including the Lebanon border. The reason for that is because they believe that with the billions of dollars that Iran is now getting as part of this deal, that they're going to be giving that to Hezbollah and some of the other terrorist groups in order to begin again to fire into terrorist activity in Israel. That's part of the damage that's been done in our relationship. Is that, can we resolve that? What can happen with the next administration to resolve that?
Jerry, the next president needs to be very bold and very clear and needs to immediately begin to undo this arrangement with the Iranians and let them know, look, this was a bad deal. The previous president made it. He's not president anymore. And the way the American system of government works, we'll now work on a different deal. And here's the deal. You're going to give up nuclear capability. We're going to reimpose the sanctions. And I know I've been hit with this already. Oh, yeah, but the Chinese and the Russians, they're not going to join in. Okay, just so they don't. We will. And by the way, there comes a point, and here's what we need to be doing. We need to be exploiting, exploring, and exporting the energy that we have in the United States, oil, gas, coal, everything that we have. And we need to begin exporting that energy and selling it to Europe, Africa, and Asia. We need to disrupt the one thing that the Iranians, the Russians, and the Saudis need to continue any nefarious activities, take their energy money away from them. And the best way to do that is to challenge them on the marketplace. Make American energy the new resource. That enriches Americans, it employs millions of Americans in the energy industry, and it disrupts the balance of power in the three most critical areas of Russia, Iran, and the Saudis. We could become the supplier to Asia, to the Africans, as well as to the Europeans. That's what we should be doing instead of trying to make some pitiful deal with the Iranians, who for 36 years have proven we can't trust them.
When we return, we'll talk about domestic issues like the Supreme Court's recent decision legalizing same-sex marriage in all 50 states. We'll be right back.
If I'm elected president, the first thing I'll do is order that an executive order that we will protect religious liberty on the part of every American, every institution, whether it's a church, a hospital, an orphanage, a social service agency, a Christian university, a Christian school, or for that matter, a Muslim school. Religious liberty would be protected because it is a constitutional guarantee.
Welcome back. Today, my guest is Republican presidential candidate Mike Huckabee. In part one, we discussed international affairs having to do with Iran and Israel. And now in part two, we're going to hit on subjects a lot closer to home. The Supreme Court has ruled that same-sex marriage is a right in all 50 states. Two questions on that. Mm-hmm. One, you have come out very outspoken against what you're calling judicial supremacy.
Yes.
Talk about that.
It's like we collectively in this country have simply forgotten ninth grade civics. Supreme Court can't make a law. And what they in essence attempted to do was to make a law. They don't have that authority. The next president needs to not go around saying, I'll introduce a constitutional amendment, I'll ask the Senate to put in a bill. I hear that and I'm thinking that's like asking John Kerry to send a strongly worded letter. And if they don't obey it, he'll send a more strongly worded letter and put it in all caps. This president, the next one, I hope it's me, because I'm the only one who said I'll do this, needs to do what Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, and Andrew Jackson did and say, Court, you're wrong, and I will not accept that decision until the people's elected representatives have created that to be a law and it has my signature and my force. That's right, because Congress is the only entity that can make a law. The Supreme Court can't. Listen, Jerry, I'm listening to people, Ivy League educated law students say, well, it's the law of the land. There's nothing we can do about it. And I'm thinking, where do you come up with that? Did you ever read the Constitution, or did you just read judicial precedents and writings over the past 70 years since we've kind of come to this conventional wisdom? But if you read the Constitution, one of the things you find out is that it's Congress that has the power of the purse, it's the executive branch that has the power of the sword, and the court, at best, can interpret or rule on the constitutionality of something, but they do not have the power to fund it, and they do not have the power to enforce it. And if the other two branches of government do not have the check and balance, then we don't have an American government anymore, because it's all built on checks and balances and the equality of the three branches.
Well, let me ask you that question, because we have an administration that is practically totally disregarding constitutional authority, rule of law, separation of powers, have almost co-opted the Department of Justice, the IRS, and EPA, and yet Congress seems absolutely powerless to do anything about it. Whatever happened to checks and balances? They're not working.
Well, it's not that Congress is powerless, it's that they are they're impotent because of their own unwillingness to exercise the power that the Constitution gives them. This is what is so disturbing to me. Congress is the check and balance to the other two branches, as the other two branches are to Congress. Each branch is accountable to the other two. And there is a magnificent system of checks and balances where if the president overreaches, the Congress can either defund, or the Congress can pass a law, or if it gets to the point, the Congress can impeach. If the courts get out of hand, the other branches can ignore it, or can change the law so that the Supreme Court can't manipulate the law.
Why is it not happening?
Because we have a donor class that feeds the political class with money, and the dance is being done by the political class to the tune of the donor class, and they don't want to rock the boat. What they want to do is make money. They don't care if it cost America its soul. They don't care if it cost America jobs. As long as they're going to get their share, I'm convinced they don't really care about the rest, and that's why they often say to political candidates, don't go there. Well, it's time we go there.
As president, what would you do to change that?
Well, for one thing, I would invoke
Are we at the tipping point, or can it be
Yes, we
changed?
are at the tipping point, Jerry, because it's time for a president to begin exercising what he says he will do when he takes the oath of office and he puts a hand on the Bible and says, I will uphold and enforce the Constitution. He simply has to go and do that very thing.
But he's not doing it, and Congress is not doing it. So as president, what would you do to correct that?
Well, for one thing, on the same-sex marriage law, I'd say that I will treat this just like the President Lincoln treated the Dred Scott decision of 1857. We'll simply ignore it.
So the battle's not over with the
Absolutely, it's not over.
same-sex
It's not.
marriage?
Oh, well, it could be if we elect a president who surrenders. If we elect the next president who capitulates in the constitutional responsibility to make sure that he protects all three branches of government as the chief executive of the country, then it could be over. It has been over for a long time because nobody's been willing to exercise the power that the Constitution gives them. What they do want to do is to exercise power the Constitution doesn't give them. So we've got a president who has pushed elements of Obamacare, illegal immigration, and now a trade bill where he may not have the authority, but he says he has a pen on the phone. But then on other areas, he will not rein in an out-of-control Supreme Court who rules ex cathedra to what the Constitution and the law actually gives him power, or gives them power to do.
Let's go back to the same-sex marriage issue for a minute, because Justice Roberts had said at one point when this passed, when he was asked the question, what does this mean to ministries, religious organizations, business owners who have convictions against same-sex marriage? And he said, it looks pretty ominous.
Yeah.
What kind of protections are going to be there for those organizations and for those business owners that are against same-sex marriage?
Without a strong president, there won't be any. It's why I said right after this decision came out, if I'm elected president, the first thing I'll do is order that an executive order that we will protect religious liberty on the part of every American, every institution, whether it's a church, a hospital, an orphanage, a social service agency, a Christian university, a Christian school, or for that matter, a Muslim school. Religious liberty would be protected because it is a constitutional guarantee. Second, I would instruct the Attorney General to vigorously defend anyone whose religious liberty rights are being infringed upon. Instead of going out there and taking on Christian people like Aaron and Melissa Klein in Oregon, who had their organization, their business Sweet Cakes by Melissa, fined $135,000, I'd send the Justice Department to defend them. I'd send the Justice Department to defend Baronelle Stutzman in Washington State, whose business Arlene's Flowers has been just about put out of business because of her unwillingness to capitulate to the demands to do a same-sex wedding. That's one thing that can be done. I do the same thing with the Department of Defense and the Secretary of Defense, and make sure that we protected chaplains and every member of the military to practice their faith. But then I would make it clear that we would not simply roll over and capitulate to an unlawful decision of 5 unelected lawyers on the Supreme Court until there was legislation by the people's representatives that put that language in. There is not one word about marriage in the Constitution, Jerry, not one word. They had to reach and find, and Justice Kennedy came up with words like spirituality and intimacy, and somehow invented a new civil right. Well, he can't do that. That's beyond the jurisdiction of the court.
By the same token, Planned Parenthood, talking about co-opting the DOJ, Planned Parenthood, some really bizarre, macabre things that I don't think, I think every person with a conscience had to be outraged at some of the things that they heard in those videos. And yet, a judge in California silences the people who produce the videos. The DOJ, rather than talking about anything with the criminal behavior, potential criminal behavior alleged of Planned Parenthood, is going after the producers. Is that part of the co-opting that we're talking about? And at some point, separation of church and powers, separation of powers has to be reinstated, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. If anything, the Department of Justice ought to be defending free speech and religious liberty, not defending the squelching of free speech, religious liberty, and in this case, squelching the expose of people who are selling, let me add, illegally selling babies' body parts like they're selling parts to a Buick. Of course that ought to be 180 degrees different than what they're doing. But under this administration, it's all about the politics. It's never about the law, and it's rarely ever about what's right, what's wrong.
When we return, Mike Huckabee will answer the question about what he believes is the most important issue facing America today. We'll be right back.
When we absolve ourselves of absolute truth and we get to relative truth, where whatever I feel, whatever I think, whatever I believe becomes right, rather than there is right and now we need to adjust our thinking, feeling, and believing to the objective standard, rather than to throw out the objective standard and live our entire culture on what I think, believe, and feel. When we do that, the moral foundation of the country collapses.
Welcome back. It was my really great pleasure to talk with presidential candidate Mike Huckabee for the second time this year. The first time was before he announced his candidacy for president, and this most recent interview occurred when he was in the Chicago area speaking about right-to-life issues at an event sponsored by the Freedom's Journal Institute. For today's final thoughts, I asked Mike Huckabee about the issue of leadership and what he thinks is the greatest issue facing America today. There was a time in America, character and leadership was very important.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much anymore. What's happened and how do we deal with this? We're seeing the effects of bad character on leadership.
Yeah. Well, when we have spent a couple of generations saying that the Bible no longer can be read in public places and seen in public schools, when our dependence upon God is essentially erased from culture because we don't acknowledge Him through prayer anymore because that might offend someone, and then when we end up living what I call the life as it was in the time of the judges, every man did what was right in his own eyes. When we absolve ourselves of absolute truth and we get to relative truth where whatever I feel, whatever I think, whatever I believe becomes right, rather than there is right and now we need to adjust our thinking, feeling, and believing to the objective standard, rather than to throw out the objective standard and live our entire culture on what I think, believe, and feel. When we do that, the moral foundation of the country collapses. And frankly, Jerry, that's where we are.
Weren't we told that this was going to happen at the Democratic National Convention?
Yeah.
When they basically said, we don't want to have anything to do with God?
Well, they pretty much made that real clear. I mean, it was a stark kind of rejection, and the notion of God being booed on the floor. That should have been a clue. But there are still people who are politically interested first and morally interested second. That's got to change. Look, we've got to hold the Republican Party to the same standards. There's a lot of Republicans who don't want to talk about God either. There are a lot of Republicans who don't want us to be the party that stands for life and marriage. So we just have to keep standing for those things, and if a party leaves us, then say sayonara, but we cannot we cannot capitulate on those basic moral convictions that we hold.
From your perspective, what is the number one issue facing America today?
I would say it's the moral clarity of our country. It's understanding that our system of government was designed to be carried out by people who understood their obligation of self-governing, which really means governing according to objective standards, governing according to righteous law, that everything else works from there. Even economics and national security still emanate from that idea that some things are right, some things are wrong. So until we get back to that, I don't think we can make enough economic tweaks in the system to save the republic. I don't think we can do enough things and build enough arms to protect the system. I think we still have to be a nation that goes back to the premise that we will ultimately be known by how we respect God and treat other people.
You know, as we're looking toward the next election in 2016, I think one of the things that is absolutely most essential, because I believe that this probably is one of the most, if not the most, important presidential election in the history of the United States. And I think it is absolutely essential as we look to the people that we're going to be voting for, that we look for someone who has the competency, someone whose political philosophy that we agree with, but at the same time that we get back to the idea that character matters in our leadership. Because if we don't, America is in huge trouble, not in the distant future, but in the near future. Character is so important. And there was a time in American politics that we really agreed on that character was very important. But as I look toward this election in 2016, I'm seeing too many non-Christians and also evangelicals, that people of whom I have respect, who really are not looking enough at the character of the people who are running for office. Absolutely essential. Character matters. Don't forget that in the next election.